On the morning of December 18th, 1944, the Second World War stopped making sense. The experts said Nazi Germany was dead. The maps said the war was over. But standing on a frozen bridge in Belgium, a 19-year-old American boy was staring directly at a monster that wasn't supposed to exist. He was facing a German King Tiger tank, a 70-ton fortress of steel that could vaporize a house from 2 miles away. Its armor was so thick that Allied shells shattered against it like glass. It was the apex predator of the 20th century. Standing against it was Francis Currey. He wasn't a commando. He wasn't a ranger. He was a 130 LLB orphan from Indiana who had never been in a fistfight in his life. He had no air support. He had no tank support. All he had was a frozen ditch, a bazooka, and a manual that said he was already dead. But Francis Currey was a farm boy. And on the farm, you don't read the manual when the wolf is at the door. You just pick up the shovel. In the next 10 minutes, this skinny teenager wouldn't just break the laws of physics. He would rewrite the history of the Battle of the Bulge. He would do things that action movies are afraid to show because audiences wouldn't believe it was real. This is the story of how one orphan alone in the snow decided to fight the entire German army. And won. To understand the sheer insanity of this moment, you have to look at the trap he walked into, the Ardennes Forest, December 1944. The American soldiers called it the Ghost Front. It was a quiet sector, a place where battered units were sent to rest and where new green units were sent to learn the ropes. The war here felt distant. The deep pine forests were silent. The snow was pristine. But the silence was a lie. While the American soldiers wrote letters home about Christmas, hiding in the mist just a few miles away, Adolf Hitler was assembling the greatest secret army the world had ever seen. Hitler knew he was losing. But he had one final desperate gamble. A plan so audacious that his own generals told him it was suicide. He stripped the Eastern Front. He pulled boys from high schools and old men from factories. He gathered the last elite remnants of the SS Panzer divisions. Over 200,000 men, 1,000 tanks, all moving at night, all under total radio silence. The experts in Allied intelligence said this was impossible. They said the Ardennes was impassable for tanks in winter. They relied on aerial reconnaissance, but the weather had turned. A thick, heavy fog, the Hitler weather descended on the forest. It grounded the Allied Air Force. It blinded the spy planes. Under that blanket of white fog, the monsters were creeping forward. Francis Currey and his unit, Company K of the 120th Infantry, arrived in the town of Malmedy on December 17th. They were told to secure a bridge. It was supposed to be a routine guard duty. They didn't know that they were standing directly in the path of the spearhead. The temperature dropped to 0. The ground froze so hard that digging a foxhole required dynamite. The men shivered in their thin coats, their boots soaking through. Francis Currey, the young sergeant, checked his men. He was quiet. He was always quiet. Most 19-year-olds in the army were loud. They bragged about girls, about cars, about what they do to the Germans. Francis didn't brag. He just watched. He watched the treeing. He watched the fog. He had a feeling. It was the same feeling a farmer gets when the birds suddenly stop singing. The feeling that the storm isn't coming. It's already here. Who was this boy standing on the edge of the apocalypse? Francis Currey was born in 1925 in New York. But his story really began when he lost everything. By the time he was 12, he was an orphan. He didn't have the luxury of a childhood. He was bounced around foster homes, uncles, finally landing on a farm in Indiana. In the 1930s, an orphan on a farm wasn't a family member. He was a hand. He worked from sunrise to sunset, pitching hay, fixing fences, driving tractors. It was a brutal life. It taught him silence. It taught him that complaining didn't fix the tractor. Crying didn't feed the cows. If something was broken, you fixed it with what you had. If a job was too heavy, you found a lever. You found a way. This wasn't military training. This was orphan grit. While other kids were playing sports, learning teamwork and rules, Francis was learning self-reliance. He learned that in the real world, nobody is coming to save you. When the war broke out, Francis tried to join the fight. He walked into the recruitment office at 17. The recruiter looked at him and laughed. He told him, "Son, you're too small. The rifle weighs more than you do." He was rejected. But Francis didn't know how to quit. He went back when he turned 18. He ate bananas and drank gallons of water just to make the minimum weight requirement. He barely passed. The army looked at him and saw a weakling. They saw a kid who should be a clerk or a cook. They didn't see his hands. Hands that were calloused from gripping frozen plow handles. They didn't see his eyes. Eyes that were used to scanning the horizon for trouble. He was assigned to the infantry. And by July 1944, he was in Europe. He wasn't the popular guy in the platoon. He wasn't the hero type. He was the one you forgot was there until the shooting started. In the months leading up to the Battle of the Bulge, his unit noticed something strange about the skinny kid from Indiana. When the mortars fell, he didn't panic. When the orders got confused, he didn't freeze. He just worked. He treated combat like a broken tractor. It was a problem to be solved. He became an expert with the bar, the Browning automatic rifle, a heavy, powerful weapon that usually required a big man to handle. Francis lugged it around like it was a toy. He mastered the bazooka, a weapon most soldiers hated because it was dangerous and unreliable. Francis tinkered with it. He learned its quirks. By December 1944, the weakling was a sergeant, a squad leader. But nothing in his life, not the farm, not the training, could prepare him for what was about to come out of that fog. December 16th, 1944. 5:30 a.m. The silence of the Ghost Front was shattered by the roar of 1,600 German artillery guns firing at once. The ground shook for miles. Trees exploded into splinters. The American front line didn't just break, it evaporated. The German offensive was a tidal wave. Confusion reigned. American units were cut off. Generals lost contact with their regiments. Panic began to spread like a virus. The roads were clogged with retreating vehicles, jeeps, trucks, ambulances, all fleeing west away from the monsters emerging from the smoke. But at Malmedy, Francis Currey's unit was told to hold. They were guarding a bridge over the Warch River, a vital choke point. If the Germans crossed this bridge, they could flank the entire American defense. Currey and his squad dug in. They watched the refugees streaming past them. They heard the rumors. The SS is coming. They're killing prisoners. They have the King Tigers. This wasn't just rumor. Just a few miles away, at a crossroads, an SS unit captured over 80 American prisoners. They marched them into a field, and then they machine-gunned them all. The Malmedy massacre. The message was clear. The Germans weren't taking prisoners. This was a war of extermination. By the morning of December 18th, Francis Currey's platoon was effectively alone. The strong point they were holding was a paper house. They had a few rifles, a machine gun, and a pile of anti-tank mines that were frozen into the mud. Francis looked at his position. He looked at the factory building near the bridge where they had set up their command post. It was a trap. If the tanks came, they would be boxed in. The doctrine was clear. If you are overrun by superior armor, you fall back to a secondary defensive line. You preserve your force. But Francis Currey wasn't thinking about doctrine. He was looking at the layout of the town. He was looking at the houses, the hedge, the ditches. His farmer's eye was calculating angles. He wasn't planning a retreat. He was planning a hunt. The sound came first. It wasn't an engine. It was a vibration in the chest. The ice on the trees began to shake, dusting the snow onto the soldiers' helmets. Then the squeal of metal on metal, the terrifying clanking of tracks that hadn't been greased. Francis Currey was in a foxhole near the bridge. He raised his head slowly. Through the morning mist, 200 yards away, a shape materialized. It was huge. It was painted in winter camouflage, white and gray jagged lines. The long barrel of the 88mm cannon looked like a telephone pole. It was a tank, but not just any tank. It was the lead tank of the 1st SS Panzer Division, the Liebende Adolf Hitler, the Führer's own bodyguard regiment. These were the U.S. most fanatical battle-hardened killers in the German military, and they weren't alone. Behind the tank, moving like shadows in the snow, were German infantrymen. Dozens of them. Francis looked to his left. He looked to his right. His squad was outnumbered 10 to 1. They were outgunned 100 to 1. The tank stopped. Its turret began to rotate slowly, mechanical, cold. It was searching for a target. The barrel lowered. It pointed directly at the building where Francis's friends were hiding. Francis Currey realized in that split second that nobody was coming to save them. The air support was grounded. The artillery was gone. The cavalry wasn't coming over the hill. He looked at the bazooka lying in the snow next to him. He looked at the tank. The farmer from Indiana took a breath. He grabbed the bazooka and he stood up. The rocket left the tube with a scream that tore through the frozen air. Francis Currey didn't wait to see it hit. He dropped into the snow instantly, curling his body into the frozen mud. A split second later, there was a metallic clang that sounded like a sledgehammer hitting a church bell. The bazooka round slammed into the King Tiger's turret ring. It didn't penetrate. It didn't explode the tank in a ball of fire like in the movies. It just shattered. But it did something more important. It blinded them. The explosion stripped away the tank's external optics. Inside that steel beast, the German crew suddenly went blind. They panicked. The turret jerked left, then right. The massive 80D Millets cannon roared, firing a shell blindly into the factory wall above Currey's head. The concussion wave hit him like a physical punch, knocking the air out of his lungs and burying him in a shower of brick dust and snow. Francis Currey lay there gasping, his ears ringing with a high-pitched whine. Most men would have stayed down. Most men would have curled into a ball and prayed for the end. Francis Currey checked his bazooka. He had no more rockets. This is the moment where the battle should have ended. A lone infantryman out of ammo, pinned down by a blind but furious tank with SS stormtroopers moving up to flank him. But this is where the farm boy logic took over. On the farm, when the tractor runs out of gas, you don't sit there and stare at it. You walk to the barn and you get more gas. Francis looked across the road. Through the smoke and the flying debris, he saw a half-track. It was an American vehicle abandoned earlier that morning in the initial retreat. It was sitting about 50 yards away, near the entrance of the factory, where 5 of his squad mates were trapped. And sitting in the back of that vehicle, uncovered and freezing in the snow, was a crate, a wooden crate marked with the yellow stencil of ordnance. Rockets. Between Francis and that crate was 50 yards of open ground. This wasn't just open ground. It was a kill zone. The German machine gunners had set up a crossfire. The air was thick with tracers, buzzing like angry hornets. The snow was kicking up in little spurts where the bullets were hitting. Francis didn't hesitate. He didn't ask for permission. He didn't wait for cover fire. He just ran. He moved with the awkward loping speed of a kid who had spent his life chasing stray cattle. Bullets zipped past his ear close enough to burn. He dove behind the half-track, sliding on the ice, crashing into the metal treads with a thud that bruised his ribs. He scrambled up the side of the vehicle. He grabbed the rocket crate. His fingers were numb, clumsy from the cold. He ripped the wood open, splintering it. He grabbed a rocket. He loaded the bazooka. But as he turned back to the street, the situation had changed. The king tiger, blinded and cautious, had pulled back behind a farmhouse. But in its place, 3 German Panzer tanks came rolling around the corner. These weren't the heavy tigers. These were Panzer IVs. They were faster, more agile, and they were supporting infantry. The German soldiers were moving house to house, clearing the town. They were methodical. They were the best trained soldiers in the world, and they knew based on the volume of fire coming from the factory that there must be a whole platoon of Americans in there. They didn't know it was just one skinny kid with a reloading problem. Francis popped up from behind the half-track. He aimed at the lead panzer. The bazooka was heavy, awkward, and notorious for misfiring in the cold. The batteries that ignited the rocket propellant would often freeze. Francis had to tap the side of the weapon, praying the circuit would close. He squeezed the trigger. Whoosh! The rocket spiraled out. It hit the lead panzer directly in the tracks. The explosion blew the heavy steel links apart. The tank slewed violently to the right, its momentum spinning it into a ditch. It was immobilized. A sitting duck. The other 2 tanks stopped. They were confused. Where was the fire coming from? Was it an anti-tank gun? Was it a hidden tank destroyer? They couldn't see Francis. He was too small. He was too low. He was hidden in the debris of the war. But Francis wasn't done. He realized the bazooka wasn't enough to stop the infantry. The German soldiers were closing in on the factory. If they reached the door, they would toss in grenades, and his friends inside, men he had eaten with, slept next to, laughed with, would be turned into meat. Francis needed a machine gun. He looked around his shopping mall of abandoned equipment. He saw a dead American soldier lying near a jeep. Next to him was a bar, the Browning automatic rifle. Francis dropped the bazooka. He ran again through the machine gun fire. He slid into the snow next to the fallen soldier. He grabbed the bar. He checked the magazine full. He rolled onto his stomach, rested the heavy bipod on a frozen rock, and opened fire. The bar is a terrifying weapon. It fires a 30 or 6 round, the same heavy bullet used by snipers at 600 rounds per minute. It creates a wall of noise and lead. Francis swept the German line. He wasn't just spraying and praying. He was shooting like a farmer, protecting his coop from wolves. Controlled bursts, short, accurate. 3 German soldiers who were rushing the factory door dropped. The others dove for cover behind a stone wall. They yelled orders to each other, screaming for a medic, screaming for suppressing fire. For the next 10 minutes, Francis Currey became a one-man army. He would fire the bar until it clicked empty. Then he would roll to a new position, grab the bazooka, fire a rocket at a tank, drop the bazooka, reload the bar, and fire again. To the Germans, this was baffling. It looked like they were facing a coordinated defense. They saw rockets coming from the left, machine gun fire coming from the right. They assumed they were fighting 10 men. They never imagined that one boy was frantically sprinting back and forth, switching weapons like a juggler, sweating through his uniform in sub-zero temperatures. But the physical toll was mounting. Every time Francis fired the bazooka, the back blast kicked up snow and revealed his position. Every time he ran, he was slower. His lungs were burning from the cold air. His hands were bleeding from the sharp metal of the ammo crates, and the Germans were adapting. They pinpointed his position near the half-track. A German officer shouted a command. A turret on one of the remaining tanks turned. Boom! A high explosive shell slammed into the ground 10 FT from Francis. The blast lifted him off the ground and threw him backward like a rag doll. He hit the wall of the factory hard. His ears were bleeding. His vision was blurry. Shrapnel had torn through his coat. He lay there in the snow, staring up at the gray sky. The pain was distant, dull. The cold was creeping in. This is the moment where the human body is supposed to give up. The adrenaline crash, the shock, the biological impulse to stay down and play dead. But Francis Currey's mind didn't go to death. It went to the work. He realized that if he stayed down, the tank would fire again, and the next one wouldn't miss. Francis rolled over. He spat blood into the snow. He checked his hands. They still worked. He checked his legs. They still worked. He stood up. The German infantry saw him rise. They must have thought he was a ghost. They had just hit him with a tank shell. Why wouldn't he die? Francis saw them preparing to rush him. He reached into his satchel. He had one card left to play. Anti-tank grenades. These weren't normal hand grenades. These were heavy rifle-fired grenades that he had modified to throw by hand. They were dangerous, unstable. If you held them too long, they would blow your arm off. If you threw them too short, they would kill you. Francis pulled the pin on one. He waited 1 second. 2 seconds. He stood up in full view of the enemy. He hurled the grenade with the arm of a kid who had spent 10 years throwing rocks at crows. The grenade sailed over the stone wall where the Germans were hiding. Crack, boom. The explosion was massive. Screams erupted from behind the wall. The German advance stalled instantly. They were terrified. They were fighting a maniac who wouldn't stay down, who had an endless supply of weapons, and who threw grenades with pinpoint accuracy. But Francis knew he couldn't hold them forever. He glanced back at the factory. The 5 American soldiers trapped inside were wounded. They couldn't move fast. They needed a distraction. A big one. Francis looked at the remaining half-track. It was still operational. It had a mounted .50 caliber machine gun on the ring mount. He climbed up the side of the vehicle. Bullets pinged off the metal plating around him like hail on a tin roof. He grabbed the handles of the .50 cal. This was the heavy hitter, the Madus, the weapon that could tear through brick walls and light armored vehicles like they were paper. Francis spun the gun around. He saw a German self-propelled gun, a massive artillery piece on tracks moving up the road to finish off the factory. Francis unleashed hell. The .50 caliber roared. The recoil shook his entire body. He walked the tracers right into the vision slit of the self-propelled gun. Sparks flew. The vehicle swerved blindingly, backing up, crashing into a house. Then he turned the gun on the infantry. He forced them to keep their heads down. He bought time, precious seconds. He screamed over his shoulder, his voice cracking from the smoke and the cold. "Get out now! Move!" The 5 trapped soldiers heard him. They saw the insane cover fire he was laying down. They burst out of the factory door, dragging their wounded comrades limping towards the woods behind the American lines. Francis watched them go. He kept firing. He was the shield. As long as that gun was firing, the Germans focused on him. He was holding the entire line. One gun, one boy. But then the gun jammed. Click. Francis pulled the charging handle. Nothing. He pulled it again. The cold had frozen the oil. The gun was dead. Silence fell over the street. A terrifying silence. Francis looked up. The Germans were realizing the gun had stopped. They were standing up. They were raising their rifles. Francis was out of rockets. He was out of grenades. His machine gun was jammed. He was alone in the middle of the street, exposed, wounded, and exhausted. He had 3 seconds before they turned him into Swiss cheese. He dove out of the half-track, hitting the ground, rolling. He scrambled towards the factory ruins. Bullets chewed up the snow where his head had been a second ago. He crawled through a hole in the wall, tumbling into the darkness of the ruined building. He lay in the rubble, his chest heaving like a bellows. He checked his ammo belt. He had his M1 Grand Rifle and 2 clips of ammunition. 16 bullets. That was it. Outside, he heard the German commander shouting. They were organizing a final assault. They were going to level the building. They were bringing up the flamethrowers. Francis crawled to a window. He wiped the fog from his glasses. He saw them coming. Not tanks this time. Men, a squad of SS pioneers. They were carrying canisters on their backs. Flamethrowers. If they got within range, they would burn the building down with him inside. It was a horrific way to die. Francis should have retreated. He had saved his men. He had done his duty. He could slip out the back and run into the woods. No one would blame him. He would get a medal just for what he had already done. But Francis looked at the bridge he was supposed to protect. If he left, the Germans would take the bridge. If they took the bridge, the tanks would cross. If the tanks crossed, they would hit the fuel depots in the rear. And if they got the fuel, the German war machine would keep rolling for months. Thousands more Americans would die. Francis Currey, the orphan from Loch Sheldrake, realized that the entire war had shrunk down to this one pile of bricks. He wasn't fighting for democracy. He wasn't fighting for the flag. He was fighting because this was his patch of dirt. And he wasn't done farming it yet. He raised his rifle. He aimed at the lead soldier carrying the flamethrower. The tank was a metal monster he couldn't hurt with a rifle. But the flamethrower, that was a walking bomb. Francis took a deep breath. He let it out slowly, watching the steam rise in the freezing air. He needed a perfect shot. If he missed, the man would pull the trigger, and Francis would be ash. He squeezed. Crack! The bullet hit the tank of the flamethrower. A ball of orange fire erupted in the street. It was brighter than the sun. The explosion consumed the German squad. The shock wave blew out the remaining windows of the factory. The burning fuel sprayed across the street, creating a wall of fire between Francis and the enemy. The German advance halted again. They couldn't move through the inferno. Francis slumped back against the wall. He was shaking uncontrollably now. The adrenaline was fading, replaced by the crushing weight of hypothermia. His hands were blue. He couldn't feel his feet. He looked at his watch. It was only 10 a.m. He had been fighting for hours, but the day wasn't over, and the Germans weren't leaving. From the smoke on the other side of the fire, he heard the sound of heavy engines again. More tanks, reinforcements. Francis checked his last clip of ammo. 8 bullets. He was trapped. He was alone. And the fire outside was starting to die down. The wall of flame that protected him was fading, and through the smoke he could see the shadows of the SS soldiers forming up again. They were angry now. They were humiliated, and they were coming to finish the job. Francis Currey loaded his last clip. He sat in the darkness, listening to the boots crunching on, the snow getting closer, closer. He gripped his rifle. He was the last man standing in Malmedy, and the hunt was just beginning. The fire that had saved Francis Currey's life was burning out. The wall of flame that separated him from the 1st SS Panzer Division flickered and died, leaving only drifting black smoke and the smell of gasoline. Through that smoke, the gray shapes of the German infantry materialized again. They were moving differently now. They weren't rushing. They were stalking. They knew the American in the ruins was hurt. They knew he was alone. And they knew he was out of heavy weapons. The cat had finished playing with the mouse. Now it was time to eat. Francis Currey sat in the rubble, gripping his M1 Garand. His hands were so cold, they felt like blocks of wood. He had 8 bullets left, 8 pieces of lead against the most elite fighting force in Europe. He checked the action of his rifle one last time. He didn't pray. He didn't cry. He just waited. On the farm, you learned that panic is expensive. Patience is free. He heard the crunch of jackboots on glass. They were inside the building. This was the moment the German commander had been waiting for. He had lost tanks. He had lost half tracks. He had lost an entire squad to a flamethrower explosion. All because of one stubborn position. He was convinced he was facing a fortified bunker manned by a team of commandos. He signaled his men to spread out to sweep the ruins room by room. But Francis Currey wasn't in the room they expected. He had crawled. While the smoke was still thick, he had belly-crawled over piles of broken brick and glass, dragging his wounded leg, moving deeper into the structure. He found a gap in the masonry, a small jagged hole that looked out onto the flank of the approaching Germans. He saw them, 4 men moving in a diamond formation, submachine guns raised. Francis raised his rifle. He took a breath, holding the freezing air in his lungs to steady his aim. Crack! The lead soldier dropped. The other 3 spun around, firing blindly into the shadows. Concrete dust exploded around Francis's face. He didn't flinch. He cycled the bolt. Crack! A second soldier fell, clutching his leg. Francis rolled away, scrambling into the darkness of the basement stairs just as a grenade bounced into the spot where he had been standing. Boom! The explosion shook the foundation of the house. Dust poured down from the ceiling. Francis coughed, tasting blood and plaster. He was deafened, but he was alive. He was playing a deadly game of hide and seek in a building that was falling apart around him. He knew the layout of the factory better than they did. He knew which floors were weak. He knew where the shadows were deepest. For the next 20 minutes, Francis Currey became a ghost. He would pop up from a cellar window, fire 2 shots, and vanish. He would emerge from a collapsed roof, drop a piece of debris to distract them, and then fire from the opposite side. He had 6 bullets left, then 4, then 2. The Germans were furious. They were screaming orders, firing at shadows, wasting ammunition on empty hallways. They were terrified. The commando team seemed to be everywhere at once. They didn't realize they were chasing one exhausted teenager who was running on pure adrenaline and spite. But luck only lasts so long. Francis was moving past a blown-out window frame, trying to get a line of sight on the officer. He stepped on a loose piece of slate. Click. The sound was tiny, but in the silence of the stalk, it was a scream. A German sniper positioned in the tree line across the road had been watching that window for an hour. He heard the click. He saw the movement. He fired. The bullet didn't hit Francis in the chest. It didn't hit him in the head. It hit the steel rim of his helmet. The impact was like being hit by a baseball bat swung by a giant. It snapped Francis's head back violently. The helmet flew off. Francis was lifted off his feet and slammed into the back wall. He slid down to the floor, his rifle clattering away from his hand. Darkness. For a minute there was nothing. No war, no cold, just a high-pitched ringing in his brain. Then slowly, the world came back. It came back as a throbbing headache that felt like a drill boring into his skull. Francis blinked. His vision was swimming. He tried to move his arms, but they wouldn't respond. His body was in shock. He heard voices, German voices. Close, Eris taught. He is dead. They were in the room. Francis lay perfectly still. He was buried under a pile of drywall and insulation that had fallen during the grenade blast. Only his boot was visible. He heard the heavy tread of boots walking past him. He heard the rattle of equipment. The Germans were securing the building. They thought they had killed him. They thought the sniper had done the job. The German officer barked a command. "See turn for secure and advance." They were leaving. They were moving past him to take the bridge. Francis Currey lay in the dust, paralyzed. His mission had failed. He had fought like a demon, but they were going to take the bridge anyway. No, the thought wasn't a scream. It was a whisper. A stubborn Midwestern whisper. Francis forced his fingers to move. He forced his eyes to focus. He saw his rifle lying 3 FT away. It looked like it was miles away. He waited until the footsteps faded. He waited until the heavy engines of the tanks outside started to rev up again. Then he moved. He dragged himself out of the rubble. He crawled to his rifle. He checked the chamber. Empty. He patted his pockets. One clip. His last clip. 8 rounds. He couldn't stop the tanks. He knew that. But he also knew that tanks don't fight without orders. He crawled to the back door of the factory. He fell out into the snow, gasping for air. The cold shock revived him slightly. He looked around. He was behind the enemy line now. He saw the German command vehicle. A half-track parked near the hedge. The officer was standing in the hatch, looking through binoculars at the bridge, confident that the way was clear. Francis Currey began to crawl. He crawled through a drainage ditch filled with frozen sludge. The ice water soaked through his uniform, numbing his chest, his stomach. He dragged his rifle through the mud, keeping the action clean. He had to get closer. The M1 Garand was accurate, but his hands were shaking so bad he couldn't hold a sight picture. He crawled 50 yards, 70 yards. He was flanking them. The dead man was coming back to haunt them. He reached the edge of the hedgerow. He was 30 yards from the officer. Francis pulled himself up. He rested the rifle on a frozen tree root. He looked through the aperture sight. The officer's back was to him. Francis didn't shoot the officer. He looked past the officer. He saw the fuel drums strapped to the back of the lead tank. The tanks were low on gas. They carried external drums to extend their range. Francis shifted his aim. He squeezed the trigger. Ping. The bullet punched through the thin metal of the fuel drum. Francis fired again. Same spot. Sparks. Francis fired a third time. Whoosh! The fuel vapors ignited. The back of the lead tank erupted into flames. The crew, thinking they had been hit by an anti-tank shell, bailed out, screaming. The burning fuel spilled onto the engine deck. The tank slewed sideways, blocking the narrow road to the bridge. The German officer spun around, looking for the source of the shot. Francis fired his fourth shot. It hit the radio antenna on the command vehicle, shattering it. Chaos. Absolute chaos. The Germans were convinced they were surrounded. The tank was burning. The radio was dead. The sniper reported killing the American, yet shots were coming from the rear. The German commander panicked. He didn't know it was one concussed boy in a ditch. He thought the American main force had counterattacked. He shouted the order. Rook, retreat. The engines roared in reverse. The infantry, terrified of being cut off, began to fall back. They popped smoke grenades, covering their withdrawal. Francis Currey stayed in the ditch, watching them go. He fired his last 4 rounds into the smoke, just to make sure they kept running. Click. Empty. Francis dropped the rifle. His head fell forward, onto the frozen dirt. He watched the gray shapes fade into the fog. The bridge was safe, but Francis Currey was dying. The adrenaline that had kept him moving for 6 hours was gone. In its place came the White Death, hypothermia. His body temperature was plummeting. He stopped shivering, a bad sign. His vision began to tunnel. He felt a strange, overwhelming warmth spreading through his chest. It was the final lie the body tells you before you freeze to death. He tried to stand up, but his legs were gone. He tried to crawl, but his arms were lead. He rolled onto his back. The sky was turning dark. Night was falling. He was going to die here alone, in a ditch in Belgium. He thought about the farm. He thought about the cows. He wondered if anyone had fixed the fence in the north pasture. He closed his eyes. The snow began to cover him. A white blanket. It felt soft. It felt like home. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. Francis drifted in the space between sleep and death. Then a sound. Crunch. 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 Boots. Francis didn't move. Let them come, he thought. Let the Germans finish it. I'm tired. A light shone in his face, a flashlight. Over here. I found a rifle. English. Check the ditch. He might be in the ditch. Francis tried to speak, but his lips were frozen shut. He managed a weak groan. Sarge, over here. I got a body. Hands grabbed him, rough, frantic hands. They brushed the snow off his face. Jesus Christ, a voice whispered. It's Currey. Is he dead? I don't know. Check his pulse. Warm fingers pressed against his neck. It's weak, but it's there. He's alive. Get the stretcher. Move your asses. It was his squad, the men he had saved. They had refused to leave him behind. They had disobeyed orders to retreat further. They had come back into the kill zone, searching the ruins, searching the ditches, looking for the orphan who had saved their lives. They lifted him up. The pain was excruciating as the blood started to move again, but Francis didn't feel it. He just felt the hands of his brothers. We got you, Francis, one of them sobbed. We got you, buddy. You're going home. Francis Currey blacked out. When he woke up, he was in a clean bed. The sheets were white. The air smelled of antiseptic. He was in a hospital in England. The doctors told him he was lucky. He had severe frostbite. He had a concussion. He had shrapnel wounds in his legs. He had lost 20 lb. But he was alive. Francis didn't feel lucky. He felt guilty. He felt like he had just done his job. He spent months recovering. The war in Europe ended. The Nazis surrendered. The King Tigers were turned into scrap metal. In July 1945, Francis was ordered to report to a stadium in Germany. He didn't know why. He thought it was a routine assembly. He stood in formation, his uniform hanging loosely on his skinny frame. He looked like a gust of wind could blow him over. A car pulled up, flags waved, a band played. Major General Leland Hobbs stepped out. He walked down the line of soldiers. He stopped in front of Francis Currey. The general looked at the boy. He looked at the citation in his hand. He looked back at the boy. Sergeant Currey, the general said. His voice boomed over the loudspeakers for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty. The general read the list: the tank, the 3 half-tracks, the rescue of 5 men, the single-handed defense of the bridge at Malmedy. The thousands of soldiers in the stadium went silent. They listened to the impossible numbers. They looked at the small, unassuming kid standing there. The general stepped forward. He placed a blue ribbon around Francis's neck, the Medal of Honor. Francis stood at attention. He saluted. He didn't smile. He was thinking about the ditch. He was thinking about the cold. A reporter snapped a photo. In that picture, Francis Currey doesn't look like a warrior. He looks like a confused teenager who wandered onto a movie set. But that image, the skinny boy with the highest honor, became the definition of American resolve. Francis went home, but he didn't go home to glory. He didn't go on a speaking tour. He didn't run for office. He didn't write a book about how he won the war. He went back to being Francis. He moved to New York. He got a job as a counselor for the Veterans Administration. For the next 30 years, he sat in a small office, listening to other men talk about their nightmares. He helped them find jobs. He helped them get health care. Most of the men he helped had no idea who he was. They didn't know that the quiet man behind the desk, the one who listened so patiently, was the ghost of Malmedy. Francis never told them. He knew that the medal around his neck didn't make him better than them. It just meant he survived. In his spare time, he gardened. He grew tomatoes. He fixed fences. He lived the quiet life that the orphanage had prepared him for. He died in 2019. He was 94 years old. He was the last surviving Medal of Honor recipient from the Battle of the Bulge. When he died, they buried him with full military honors. But on his tombstone, it doesn't list his kill count. It doesn't list the tanks he destroyed. It just lists his name and his rank. Because Francis Currey taught us something important. We live in a world that is obsessed with power. We look for heroes who are strong, who are loud, who are invincible. We look for supermen. But real history isn't written by supermen. It's written by orphans. It's written by farm boys. It's written by the quiet ones who are terrified, who are freezing, who are out of ammo, and who stand up anyway. Francis Currey proved that strength isn't about how hard you can hit. It's about how hard you can get hit and keep moving forward. It's about the refusal to accept that the math is against you. On December 18th, 1944, the German army brought a tank to a knife fight. But Francis Currey brought something stronger. He brought the grit of a man who had nothing left to lose, and that made him the most dangerous man in the world. If this story of the underdog who broke the German war machine inspired you, please hit the like button. It helps us dig up more of these forgotten legends. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next story of the heroes who walked quietly among us. History is full of missing pages. We are here to write them back in. Thanks for watching.